now in the post-lunch session.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of Senator Connie, to move the second reading of the Stamp Duty Amendment Bill 2020. When she makes the motion, I will then
Mr. President, as we seek to open debate on item number 3, I respectfully ask that this chamber consider treating items 3 and 4 as a cognate debate as they relate to the same matter.
The question is that items 3 and 4 on the order paper be treated as related to one another as a cognate debate. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Please proceed, Senator.
Thank you, sir. Mr. President, the two bills that are combined for cognate debate, they together contribute to the transformation of the justice system and to the modernizing of judicial services in Barbados. I have to say, Mr. President, that the world has truly gone digital, and certainly justice systems around the world are starting to make the transition, some at different paces, at a different pace than others. But we, nonetheless, in Barbados have to continue to be on pace with the rest of the world. And before I get into the details, I want to say that indeed, digital is not the answer to all of the challenges that we have in our justice system, but it certainly enables us to put our system on a better footing to be able to engage with the world. I will not go into the details now, sir, of all of the other reforms that have happened within our justice system, whether it came to adding courts, adding judges, doing training, and adding a whole bunch of other areas that contribute to our forward step. I believe there'll be another time for that, sir. But the two bills before us, which is the Stamp Duty Amendment Bill and the Registration of Judgment Bill, Amendment Bill, both of them treat, Mr. President, to enabling electronic transactions within the justice system. Certainly the Stamp Duties Amendment Bill, it speaks to how stamps can be applied to certain legal documents. Sir, you as a practicing lawyer, sir, at one point and continuing today, you would know that there was the time when adhesive stamps, the ones you either lick or wet and you stick on, and those ones that could be applied by dye on certain legal documents, that was the way of the world. However, now, sir, there is a way for us to apply certain stamps electronically. However, our legislation did not properly permit for that to be done in all cases, and so the Stamp Duty Amendment Bill significantly helps us to move from that old way of applying various stamps. Section 2 actually said that you must have an adhesive stamp and the stamp must be applied by dye. That is no longer applicable. Also, in the Stamp Duty Amendment, we understand now that if we're going to move to electronic stamps, we also have to allow the act that relate to electronic transactions to be applicable within this context. And therefore, that has been applied, that the Electronics Transaction Act would indeed apply in this case as well. With regards to the second bill, which is part of this cognate, which is the Registration of Judgments Amendment Bill, It allows for the electronic registration of judgments, so that if a judgment is obtained or confessed, really and truly, the registrar can now maintain an electronic register, as well as these judgments be filed electronically. Sir, this is just another one of the steps in the direction of the judicial systems going digital internationally. Back in March of 2019, sir, the Cabinet of Barbados decided it would make a further investment in case management software for the Supreme Court. In the interest of so doing, we recognized that we would need to make amendments to several pieces of legislation, including these two, and we anticipate that there will be further amendments to other legislation to make sure that they're all aligned at this point. I will not go through the list. There were about 8 pieces, sir, that had indeed been identified, of which the 2 that are being considered at this sitting now are just 2 of those 8. It is not as if Barbados is now starting from scratch, sir. Barbados did have the Judicial Enforcement Management System, acronym GEMS, in place. It was purchased in 2009, and under the Justice Improvement Program for Barbados. That system, sir, provided the courts with the ability to electronically manage most aspects of cases, from the initial filing all the way down to deposition. And that system certainly went a long way in terms of helping us to improve the court registry and to facilitate faster generation of court dockets and to cause lists and schedules, etc., to be heard by the various judges and the master of the High Court. However, sir, we recognize that that GEM system, the Justice Enforcement Management System, it had served its purpose for a time. However, there was opportunity and there was need indeed for us to continue to move forward and look for different types of case management software that would deal with some of the deficiencies of GEMS. Certainly some of those deficiencies were that that system did not provide for e-filing of documents. Additionally, it could not be accessed 24/7. In addition, it could not be accessed from any geographical location. In addition, it did not provide for integration with other government departments, would lead to be interoperable with the system. It also was not easy for management reporting to be easily customized. It was not easy for it to be customized. And therefore, we started in earnest to look for other opportunities to create, to digitalize the process as well as to use digital records. So a new court management software was brought into place. We use Courier in particular. And what is exciting about this, Mr. President, is that it was designed right here in the Caribbean for our region right now. It was designed by a company called Apex Advanced Performance Exponents Inc., Apex, which is a company that is supported, sir, by the Caribbean Court of Justice, and it is supported by the heads of government of CARICOM. And in fact, it is the Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ, which is the highest appellate court for Barbados, that actually uses the system. It is therefore beneficial, sir, that the Supreme Court, and that we should indeed ensure that the systems that we use share similar platforms and are able to truly communicate with each other. Sir, I share that only to say that this is part of the steps towards modernizing and transforming not just the judicial service system, but also the services that are associated there too, that can be accessed by both the legal professionals as well as the litigants. Sir, going forward, we have to be mindful that we have now what we did not have before. Mr. President, sir, when you entered the chamber this morning, and I see it now, I saw a suitcase-like container, a briefcase, that I have often seen lawyers walk with for years. We now, sir, I know, sir, that you are quite healthy, but indeed that can cause great pain to joints and bodies having to lug around with those kinds of documents. And sir, now that we have the internet, and now that we have advanced hardware, and now that we have cutting-edge software, the opportunity to look out for the health and well-being of lawyers is certainly upon us, as we are now able to reduce those bulging briefcases and be able to allow you to file and to do various transactions without necessarily hurting yourself. The expectations too, sir, of both the professionals as well as litigants, those persons who come before the court, those expectations have changed, sir. People now expect that they will be able to do things digitally. In this honorable chamber, I see about 5 different lawyers, attorneys, and some of them of different generations, sir. And that I see right now, wow. And so, and I am sure that many of them will tell you that the expectations have changed from generation to generation as to how they will be able to interact. Generations of wisdom. That is what we are talking about here, not generations in terms of age, Senator. We are talking about generations of wisdom. The intention, certainly, sir, is that they would be able to work in digital and electronic format, and that in all that, even as we joke at this time, there's more serious drawbacks at this time where people have an expectation that the system will not be so costly to its users. And we believe that by going digital, we can reduce that cost. That it is too time consuming, the old way and the way that many of us are still doing it now, which is not necessarily using the technology and the digital and electronic formats that are about. That sometimes we are out of step with what is happening in the rest of the world. There are all kinds of reasons and drawbacks, sir, of the current system. And I want to share an experience with this honorable chamber. Twice in the last 2 years, I had the opportunity to collaborate with the Caribbean Telecommunications Organization, CTO, which has been developing what is called FutureScape. FutureScape is a way for us to see what a single information, communication, and technology space, a single ICT space within the Caribbean might look like. And I recently had the opportunity to see the demonstration of court in action using the technology. We had a judge in one country in the Caribbean. We had the lawyer in another country. And then we had the person who had been brought before the court, the accused, in a different country. And they were able to conduct that case entirely virtually, with files having been filed electronically. And justice was given, even at that distance, even at a lower cost. And those countries who were short on certain types of human resources were able to use a judge from a different part of the region to be able to deliver a judgment on a case where 3 of the major parties were not in the same place. This is just a vision of the futurescape, the way that we are able to see the future as it relates to this sector and to the work of jurists. But I want to say, sir, that when we talk about future scape, and you saw in the example that I just gave, that going digital is not just about substituting electronic documents. That's not what it is. It is also, sir, about replacing the physical courtroom in so many different ways. And that judicial services can then be delivered across the internet. As I mentioned, sir, and it's worth reiterating, we can now make such services more accessible to those who live far from legal services and their agents, and it makes costs more effective. Sir, I could go on and on about what the future could look like as we continue to make that transition and evolve our systems and our services to operate in a more digital world. But I believe that the two bills before us very ably help us to see the single steps that we need to make at the legislative level to be able to create the environment for us to get our judicial systems and services ready for 21st century. And it is with these few words, Mr. President, that I beg to move this bill be read a second time.
Recognize Senator Drakes.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will not be long as it relates to amending these two pieces of legislation, because I agree with what the Honourable Member has stated, as these are pieces of legislation that are making amendments to more or less modernize the judicial sector, one, and then as it relates to the Stamp Duties Act. And obviously it is a case where we're standing in an environment where social distancing is being required and all of these other new normals, and possibly it is a case that these new protocols are actually propelling the use of digital technology in a way that if we'd stayed the way we were, we probably would not have been so ready and willing to accept the modernization of a lot of the processes that we currently have. So, sir, I just want to say I support the bills, and I really hope that we continue to add pieces of legislation and these types of amendments to the law books, because the world really does not owe us anything, and we have to stay in step with what is happening globally as it relates to digitization and the modernization of how we do things here in Barbados. So with that contribution, sir, I am obliged.
Thank you. Senator Greenwich.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to say a few words on this, in this debate, a debate that relates to the Stamp Duty Amendment Bill and the Registration of Judgments Amendment Bill, both of them 2020. I want to speak more so though on the judgment register, the registration of judgments. And just to let you know, sir, that the judgment register, that, sir, is a register or a book that is required by law. It's required by law to be kept by the registrar of the Supreme Court as part of the records of the court. There's this judgment register. And, sir, that particular register, sir, is not to be confused with the many other books or registers kept by the law courts as well. And I mean, sir, other registers such as the Register of Births, the Register of Deaths, the Register of Marriages, the Register of Copyrights, the Register of Deeds. And by deeds, sir, I mean, and you would know, sir, things like conveyances, things like deeds of gift, things like assents, and so on, that would make up the Register of Deeds. Also, sir, there's the Register of Wills, Register of Trademarks and Patents. And because there are various acts in our legislation that speak to their own respective registers. And therefore, there are a number of them. But the one that we concentrate on today is the Judgment Register. But as basically and as simply as possible, Mr. President, judgments are entered in our Register of Judgments. You can't get more basic than that. Judgments are entered in the Register of Judgments. And so these judgments are usually the result of debts owed by one person to another, and sometimes owed by one person to a company, to an organization, to the NIS, for instance. And I can tell you, sir, that, as you would know, the NIS at the registry has its own register. And, sir, these judgments are entered in the register on behalf of the judgment creditor against the judgment debtor. And in the register, that judgment register, it names the person or the entity to whom the money is owed. It also names the person who actually owes the money. It states the amount that is owed. It states the date of the judgment. And it also gives the date that that particular judgment was registered. All that information is detailed in the judgment register. And sir, you and I would know that an individual very often has several judgments against him or her in the same register. One individual can have more than one judgment against him or her. And it is sometimes fairly dangerous for judgment creditors when they do not register their judgments. Because in refusing to do so, they very often pay very dearly for such neglect. Because put as simple as possible, Mr. President, the judgment that is registered gets priority. The judgment that is registered in that register gets priority. And if you don't register your judgment, it means that you go to the back of the line, and when the day of reckoning comes, you may not get anything. So it's best to have that judgment registered in that register. Mr. President, again, you and I would know that searches of the judgment register can be a very tedious task, can be extremely tedious. Those books are
Dusty
have been
and large.
described. You have just called them big and dusty. Some people call them big and musty. That's a fact, sir. They are big books. They're extremely dusty.
Men sneeze for hours.
You sneeze for hours. See what I mean? You know that, sir. And, sir, many searches done by the legal clerks today, sir, are still done manually. As you say, there's a lot of sneezing and so on. It is tedious work. And not only that, the actual indexing sometimes is very strange, and the method can be extremely confusing. For instance, sir, you will have a volume where you have all A's. You'll have another one with all B's in the alphabet. And, sir, there is, but you wouldn't find all Alines together, or you wouldn't find all Archibalds together. You'll find all A's together, but then you have to go and decipher from among those A's which particular A is the one that you want. There's no particular order. And so you can get a situation where you find a Brathwaite before you find Bab, and so on. And you have to be there searching and searching, because all the register is interested in is that these are the A's. These are the A's. So that search, it can be extremely tedious. Long list. It can be extremely exhausting, extremely bothersome. And you go through that list maybe for 2 weeks before you have done a thorough search. Because if you want to do a thorough or a proper search, Mr. President, you can start with the year 2017. You might find this particular person that you're looking for and the judgment. You may find another one in 2000. And then the next judgment for that person might be in 1973. And all that time you have to be searching all the registers till you get to 73, where you find this particular person. So, Mr. President, one thing that all the legal assistants, I believe, would know is that you do not readily purchase land from a person who has an outstanding mortgage or an outstanding judgment or other encumbrance recording against him or her. So their job, the legal assistant's job, Mr. President, is usually to search or investigate the title to the land and to see whether that land is clear or not. Mr. President, I have been reliably informed that because of the constant use, these books, these registers are in bad condition.
Overused.
Pages are missing from some of the books. Some pages really and truly are only half pages. A lot of the edges have broken off because the paper is old and brittle. Overuse. Remember, Mr. President, that these judgments are put in these registers for public information and for public inspection. The register is indeed, sir, a public document. And you may have about 500 plus persons and using legal clerks and so on, using those particular books in a single week. And as you know, sir, some persons using them might be smooth, others might be rough. Some might be careful, sir, others might be clumsy. Some might be extremely circumspect, sir, others might be reckless. And as you would know, sir, and I would know, if you allow too many people to drive your car, you're looking for trouble. And spare thought, sir, for those books. So I could not reflect on the register of judgments without saying, it's almost like a temptation, without saying a few words about the deeds, the book that you would record the deeds in. Conveyances, assents, deeds of gift, and so on, the buying and selling of land. And that book is extremely important because every single land transaction has to be done in writing. And therefore, you had some copying to be done. And so when I look at that particular deeds book, and I look like in the 1940s and so on, and the 1950s, I noticed that the people who actually had to copy those conveyances in the deeds book, sir, the handwriting was impeccable. The handwriting, there was superb penmanship. And you could, as you read those things, you almost get the feeling that those persons took extreme pride in the way that their letters were formed. You could almost see that they were fussy people, meticulous people, very, very circumspect. Because, sir, one of the things you have to realize is that at that time, sir, you didn't have the thing that we call whiteout and so on going around. These people had to be very, very careful. Very, very careful with what they were doing. They could not afford, Mr. President, to be careless or sloppy. No erasing, nothing of the sort. And I knew of one person who actually told me that he used to do some copying of those conveyances. And he said, sir, that he used to use a ruler to cover the line that he had just copied to make sure that he did not copy the same line twice. Because, as I said, you just could not afford to make a mistake. And he also spoke to me, sir, about the attitude of some of his fellow employees who would always make the comment that I have to be here at this desk, I have to be here confusing my head with all of those probate matters or all of those foreclosure matters, and all you do is to be copying, and you get more money than me. And that, he said, was the attitude of some people towards him. All you do day after day, week after week, month after month is copy, and you getting more money than me. But, sir, as I reflect on it, sir, they were copying like that for me and for you. Because, as you would know, sir, if we want to get a good root of title, very often we have to go back today and see where that conveyance first showed itself. And sometimes when you read them, I remember reading one related to a relative of mine, my grandfather, O'Neill Greenwich, bought a piece of land from John Marshall, but it said O'Neill Greenwich speculator, whatever speculator was. That is supposed to be his occupation. And it cost 10 shillings. because that's what the land cost at that time. Perhaps nowadays that is a big set of money. But when you read it, sir, you smile. And where the handwriting is concerned, this is just by the way too. Also had a friend who, to this day, this friend has about 24 letters which her late parents wrote to each other. And she says that she has a reluctance, there's a reluctance to get rid of them. She doesn't want ever to part with them. And she says it's not because of the content of the letters or anything like that. It is the handwriting, she says. It's the way people then seem to have taken that love for forming their letters and writing. Mr. President, as you would know, sir, for a few years now, attorneys at law, together with their legal clerks, have been highlighting the need for us to computerize our court records. And they are always talking about the need for electronic records. We in Barbados, sir, must have proper records in these modern times. We must. And I want to say, Mr. President, that this registration of Judgments Amendment Bill 2020 is indeed a masterstroke. A lawyer, sir, will not have to wait for 2 weeks to obtain the result of his legal clerk's search any longer. And indeed, sir, legal clerk should be able to access judgments without having to spend long hours at the registry. With this amendment, sir, you do not have to be physically looking in a book. Ideally, what we want is a situation now, as we are in these COVID times, where persons can stay perhaps in their own office and do a search without even having to go into the court. And so, sir, I believe that it is better for posterity that records be stored electronically than our keeping them in a book. I am not one of these electronically minded people. I even think at one stage they call myself a dinosaur. But I'm a dinosaur who is fairly forward looking. Yeah, I am. I don't like licking stamps. Stamps. Mr. President, the only fear that I would have, sir, the only one that I would feel that would hang over our head is that ever-present fear of the system crashing and losing all of your information. And so, sir, I would urge those in authority to manage the system as best as they can and to upgrade the system whenever it is necessary to do so.
You have to insert necessary techniques, don't you?
Yes, whatever techniques are required, by all means, use and insert those techniques. Mr. President, today in Barbados, banks, credit unions, insurance companies, pharmacies already have their records digitized. I make the bold statement that government must fall in line and that all of our government records should be digitized too. All government departments. This is where the world is going. I'm a dinosaur, but I'm a forward-looking dinosaur. And this is where Barbados must go, and we must not be left behind. Mr. President, sir, let me put in a plug here. The creation of the Ministry of Information and Smart Technology is in itself an indication of government's resolve to create a more efficient public service. And I do not think that this ministry could be in better hands. We have heard Senator McCartney speak about future scope. You said scope or scale? Scale. And her government, so her ministry, sir, has been speaking consistently about the ease of doing business in Barbados. I think that she has been doing an excellent job, sir. You know, sir, a better court system is not only about the cases that we do in the court. And a lot of people seem to think that way because they might very well be involved. My case is taking too long. My lawyer is too slow, something. But that is not necessarily what it is all about. When we speak, sir, about improving our court system, this must include, Mr. President, the registration of judgments. It must include the ability, Mr. President, to get a birth certificate in 2 or 3 days from the court.
And death too.
It must, and death certificate too, yes, sir. It must include, Mr. President, accessing court records in a timely manner. All of this goes together to make a good a better court system. Because, Mr. President, what does it profit us to have a visitor arrive in Barbados seeking information about his foreparents and his ancestry, only to realize that the pages in that birth register, that those pages are missing or that the leaves are torn up? Sometimes, I remember an instance where I think it was something like 1842 to 1864. Those were missing. And the fellow almost cried because that is what he had come for, because he wanted to make that connection between his England and his foreparents. All of them were missing.
The records at the archives of the
I think it happened at the archives. I think that is where he was, where he went to. But so, Mr. President, to say that this measure here is timely may even be an understatement. Indeed, we may now be a bit late in doing what we should have done a few years ago, because so much damage might already have been done to those books. Accessing the computerized records, Mr. President, makes life a lot easier. Because this is what happens on sites such as Ancestry.com and those where others rate so highly. So many of us rate them very, very highly. And Mr. President, I want to see the day when others can say that Barbados is rated highly too. Mr. President, I therefore have no problem whatsoever in supporting this particular amendment or these particular amendments to the Stamp Duty Amendment Bill and the Registration of Judgment Amendment Bill. I'm grateful to you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I see him, but I want to speak.
Yeah, Boyce. Boyce.
Senator Boyce, did you signal your willingness? Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Mr. President. Good afternoon, fellow members of this honorable House. Before I start, I don't know if we recall the last time we were here. The circumstances seemed a bit more bleak. I think we should perhaps take a moment to appreciate the fact that here we still stand and we're able to see each other again and gather to do the people's business, recognizing what we have so far survived, and perhaps express some gratitude for being able to see each other and interact so plainly. Now, Mr. President, during this period where we were apart physically, I'm sure there were some of us who kept in contact by other means. For my part, I was home with my family, a fantastic experience, Mr. President. And one which I'm sure caused persons to appreciate that which they have. But also, sir, during this period, during this COVID period, sir, the rule of law continued in the island unabated. And we are quick to criticize and we're quick to make commentary about what's not being done. So perhaps we should also be quick to give kudos when things are actually moving forward. I can personally attest to the fact, Mr. President, that court cases continued via a variety of platforms, either via Zoom, some judges were doing it via teleconference, and the registry and the judges of this nation, Mr. President, should be commended for getting on with the business of justice, sir. And how this was done was almost through an acceptance that there could not be any restriction on the resolution of these issues during the period when you were confined to your premises. I believe it was once said that if a man can't find justice in the law courts, he will go and find it somewhere else. And during this period, there was the communication, which was certainly different, but the end result were that matters were being heard and being discussed and being resolved as far as practical. Now, sir, that's not to say this applied to all matters. There are some matters that were simply adjourned. There are some matters that were simply pushed forward. But what we were able to see during this period, Mr. President, was the ability of the courts to get on with the business of the nation. And the fact is that everyone was willing to play their role in supporting that exercise. So when we come here now to debate another weapon in the arsenal which will allow this process to continue, we should be able to say that we have seen historically that this can be done. And we should be encouraged by what we saw, Mr. President, and recognize that it bodes well for the future implementation. Now, having heard my colleague, the Deputy President, speak, I will limit some aspects because I think by now you all know I like to give some historic analysis, Mr. President, of some aspects of the different legislation. And it was interesting to hear the speaker on behalf of the government who was introducing the bill, our Senator McConney, refer to the generations of legal practitioners, maybe, one or two, I don't know if we go generations, 30 years being the test, sir. But the point is, the history and the utilization of stamps and the history and the utilization of registration of judgments is a fantastic indication of where we are and where we're coming from. The concept is this: if you wanted to get your justice from the government, well, you had to provide the government with some incentive to facilitate the justice process. Essentially, you had to render unto Caesar to seek the assistance of the courts. You were therefore making a payment in the form of your stamps and your relevant duties. And by this exercise, you were supporting the activities of the government in facilitating the coexistence, sir. Indeed, Mr. President, you and the other lawyers in here would recognize that there are Barbadian authorities which have explicitly stated that if you do not comply with some of your tax obligations, you cannot come to a court of equity and seek assistance, seeing that you don't have the clean hands. But that's the history of the concept of where we utilize stamps and the duties. And the stamps that we use, my father-in-law is one of these stamp collectors, have a lot of historic significance. And they actually used to be sought after by those who were engaged in this exercise because they are of wide variety and historic significance. And then when you start to get into how the mechanization of the process was, and the seal and the stamping and the embossing, it's quite a lot. But as all things go, we move forward. Similar in relation to judgments, there was a process whereby judgments will have to be recorded. Now, there is some dichotomy as to whether a judgment needs to be recorded to be enforced, but that's an intellectual exercise. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that if you had a judgment against someone, you needed to have a record of that judgment somewhere to establish your priority for what other means you were utilizing. And there was this facet of the historical utilization of the judgment and the registration of the judgments, and it had to be entered in the judgment book. What would invariably happen, though, was for every sip there's a miss. And you will find that in some instances, a judgment that you ought to have had was not recorded. Mr. President, you would inform me of some wily practitioners who would ensure that judgments were not recorded, although I have personally never encountered that facet of the legal practice, sir. So the concept of having an electronic register certainly is useful, it is practically sound, and there should be the resulting increase in searches and the resulting increase in the ease of doing business if it is implemented. Of course, in its implementation is where we need to ensure it's done in a manner which allows it to account for the issues which were raised by Senator Greenidge. Firstly, the facilities, the training, the security, the obligations under the data protection legislation, your staff upskilling, the simple fact that you have to have persons with the ability to retrieve, enter, and compile this data. Then there is the other facet in terms of access to the data. So what was also encountered during what I can't coin it, but during the COVID period when there were matters moving forward, was that certain persons who didn't have the necessary access to the technology were not able to take their matters forward. So what happens to those persons if we adopt an entirely digital infrastructure? So of course, as in all things, there should be some measure of balance with regard to its implementation. I don't know why Senator Greenidge referred to himself as a dinosaur, a young man like himself, sir. I certainly don't condone that attitude in terms of what he was utilizing, sir. You know, but the fact is there are persons who will be somewhat reluctant, Mr. President, in adopting new technology. So in everything else, let's perhaps take a phased approach with regard to its implementation. Also, in seeking to introduce this level of technology, we do see the benefits with regard to cost, and we do see the benefits with regard to time. The problem is there is also the risk now that is incurred when the clerks are doing their judgment searches in a digital format, and that digital format has, for whatever reason, an error with regard to what is entered. The courts have been quite strict in attributing liability. There are lots of cases where lawyers have gone and said, quite expressly, wallah, 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 we did the search and it was not there, and the court may not have been as willing to accept the excuse proffered. It's just a reality because of the obligation. So how do we ensure that all these factors are considered? But long story short, this is legislation which goes forward and takes the nation forward with regard to the judicial practice and should be supported, sir. And while we're on the area of justice and judgments, I think, sir, it would be remiss if we did not, at this moment, note the action of our brothers and sisters in the diaspora and outside, whose actions have, in the words of MLK, focused the world's attention on their discontent, Mr. President. And maybe we do it quietly, but we express our hope that the situation is rectified sooner rather than later. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator McConney.
Mr. President, thank you very much. And I want to thank the honourable members who took the opportunity to speak just now. And I just, Mr. President, want to respond to a couple of the issues that were raised by both Senator Greenidge as well as Senator Boyce, and to share some things which I hope will give you some additional comfort. Senator Greenidge, you spoke about the tedious process of finding judgments in big, dusty, sometimes musty books. You talked about the fact that electronic is better. And I certainly, as the minister responsible for innovation, science, and technology in my other world, will agree with you that in many cases, electronic is better. You spoke about the need for government records to be digitized. And I thought that I would share a little update with you. The Cabinet, over a year ago, identified the priority agencies that will go, and we determined which agencies will be priority based on the biggest bugbearers for the public, especially because as a citizen-centered government, we have to put the people's interests and needs and concerns and expectations first. And indeed, number of those agencies, sir, that were earmarked as first movers in digitization were the Customs Department, Immigration, Registration, the Police Department, the Licensing Authority, International Business and Town Planning. And you would have noticed that some effort and some advancement has been made, particularly with working with the police, the certificate of character, which impacts over 26,000 people every year. That is now digitized from start to finish. That has been completed, and we have digitized over 66,000 of those records, which were in the state that you would have mentioned, where some of them had the edges broken off and it was dusty. Somehow we were able to do that, and the police department is now keeping those records up to date. So we not only have done the back records, but now we're keeping them up to date going forward. That was certainly one of the commitments. You mentioned about the registration department and seeing births and deaths and those certificates. We're in the process right now, about 37% through, of starting to digitize over 93,000 of those records right now. And we're working again with a local company right here in Barbados, using local resources and businesses, especially at a time like this. And birth certificates and death certificates are some of those that are on the card. Of course, we will not do all of them, but the key ones that were identified by the registration department using their own criteria is what we're digitizing, and we expect that certainly by the end of this financial year they will be fully digitized, or at least most of those records will be digitized, and that they can be easily searched in the way that you have described. You also would know that the licensing authority is one of the agencies. I am hoping that many of you will be smiling by the end of June, where you're able to pay for the renewal of your driver's licenses online. And we are looking forward again. Senator Boyce spoke about the fact that we have to do things in phases because we cannot digitize everything all at once. But rather than speak of all the other work that's going on, including in immigration, where we are currently digitizing over 200,000 records, again, looking to make it easier for you to do business with the Immigration Department. We are also working on an electronic document and records management system for the entire public service. And again, I'm hoping I'll put a smile on your face. We now have the test site up. We have some persons who are the test persons working in this new test environment. We expect certainly that in the first of those ministries, we will go live in 2 weeks, and then we will go from one ministry to the next, to the next, to the next, over the next little while. I think one of the things that I want to ask this country to do is to manage our expectations, because when you're doing massive digitizations of this size, you have to build a firm, strong foundation before you start doing the work. And I want us to understand that sometimes you have to go slowly at first so you can go faster later on. But we have to make sure that we get the foundation in place. So we are starting, as I said, the test site is up. We have people in there interacting live with the electronic documents and records management system, and hopefully we'll be able to roll out ministry by ministry over time. There is so much more good news that I could possibly share with you. One of the things that you were talking about, sir, Senator Greenidge, was about the systems crashing, etc. Certainly, things can happen to paper records. Fires can happen, water damage can happen, they can be destroyed. In the electronic world, yes, records can be destroyed, but one of the things we have done is to do a better job, and we are not perfect. We are doing better as we go forward in terms of ensuring that there is backup, and redundancy. When we say backup and redundancy, what does that mean? Backup in that if at 3:32 today the system went down, that we're able to back up what was in the system as at that time. So there is somewhere else a copy of everything that would have been in that system at the time. And redundancy is basically so that if things, heaven forbid, that there's some kind of catastrophe, as we were talking about earlier, that there's enough redundancy that you have continuity of business, which are two different things between whether you have redundancy and whether you have backup. So again, we are putting those things in place to ensure that to the best we can right now, and we will get better as we go forward, that there is both backup and there's redundancy in the system that will help to mitigate the kinds of risks that you spoke about. I will not take up much more of this time. I will, however, speak to Senator Boyce, who spoke about training, the need for training. That process has certainly started. It is a necessary part. It is part of the change management. It is about giving people the capacity to truly do what needs to be done in the new environment. And as you would understand, Senator, and all in this honorable chamber, not everyone moves at the same pace. And we are only as strong as our weakest link. And it means that until we are able to get persons to make that shift in mindset, as well as that shift in skills, that we will still perhaps have some lags and some imperfections in certain areas. But the truth is, the world is not turning back, nor can we. And therefore, those who we will have to invite into these spaces who are currently now resistant, the truth is, resistance is futile. At this point in time, we simply have to dig in, help each other through, and do so with compassion and empathy as we move forward. You also spoke about the risks of errors, etc. I think that we simply have to be better at doing quality control. And it means that some of the people who prior would have been the ones with the rules trying to do the writing, etc., their job can now be moved into higher value jobs, such as quality control, as opposed to basic entry, because the basic entry can be done by the professionals who are part of the system. As you can tell, I am excited and I'm all ready to go on. I could go on forever, but Mr. President, I know that this chamber have a limited time. This chamber has a very limited time. And with these few words, sir, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
This is which one, number 4? Number 3. The question is that the bill under consideration, Stamp Duty Amendment Bill, be now read a second time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Okay.
Leave the chair.
I do now leave the chair.
Leave the chair. Doing 3. Do 3 first.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do now leave the chair and this bill now be considered in committee.
The question is that I do now leave the chair. And the Senate resolved itself into a committee of the whole Senate for further consideration of the bill in detail. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, and we are now in committee in relation to item number 3 before.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clauses 1 to 4.
Mr. Deputy President, Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that that clauses 1 to 4 stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 to 4 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill from committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passage of the bill under consideration in committee.
I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that the bill under consideration be now read a third time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Stamp Duty Amendment Act 2020.
The question is that the bill under consideration do now pass and be so cited. All honourable members in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. And the bill is now being passed and will be cited as the Stamp Duty Amendment Act 2020.
Order number 4, sir. In the name of Senator the Honourable K. McConney, to move the second reading of the Registration of Judgments Amendment Bill 2020.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do now leave the...
Bill be read a second.
I beg to move that this bill be read a third time.
Second.
Second time.
The question is that the bill under consideration be now read a second time. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do now leave the chair and this chamber resolve itself in committee for further consideration of this bill.
Question is that I do now leave the chair. That the Senate resolve itself into a committee, the whole Senate, for the further consideration of this bill, item number 4, in committee. Those in favor, all honorable members in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. We are now in committee.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clauses 1 and 2.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 and 2 stand part. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passage of the bill under consideration in committee.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that the bill under consideration be now read a third time. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Registration of Judgments Amendment Act 2020.
Question is that the bill under consideration do now pass and be so cited. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The bill has been passed and will be so cited. That is as the Registration of Judgment Amendment Act 2020.
Order number 1, sir. In the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve A, the change of the public purpose of the compulsory acquisition under the Land Acquisition Act, Chapter 228, of a parcel of land, the property of the Crown, situate at Maxwell in the parish of Christchurch, dated 20th of December 2001, from that of the provision of beach access and public parking facilities to that of tourism development and public parking. And B, the lease in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, to Mahogany Park, Inc., of the said parcel of land for the public purpose of tourism development and public parking.
Mr. President, I rise to speak briefly on this resolution, which I note has been here on the order paper for some time, I believe since February. To follow up to the introduction, I will try to give a background of the whole process as to why we are here and why this resolution is here. In 2001, a decision was taken by the government at that time to acquire on Maxwell Coast Road two pieces of land, one on the seaward and one on the leeward side, to provide public access to the sea and a public parking. The Cabinet, therefore, at its meeting on 8th of November 2001, approved the acquisition of two parcels of land at Maxwell Christchurch. The one on the seaside was 496.5 square meters, and the one on the leeward side, land side, was 1,310.5 square meters. These properties were subsequently vested in the Crown. After the completion of the acquisition, the NCC was asked to submit a proposal regarding the building on the Maxwell site. I believe it was known previously as the Maxwell Great House, an abandoned building. NCC was asked to submit a proposal regarding the building on that building that was acquired for public parking. With no action having been taken by the NCC, the building on that site deteriorated, and no further correspondence was received from the NCC, despite there being issued with several reminders. The property finally deteriorated to the level that required the intervention of the Environmental Protection Department. And on December the 14th, 2015, some 14 years after the acquisition, the EPD issued a notice to the Crown under Section 11(1) of the Health Services Act, indicating that the Ministry of Housing and Lands was in violation of the Health Services regulations as it related to rodents, the Health Services Mosquito Control Regulations 1970, and the Health Services Nuisance Regulations. As such, it was recommended that the property be demolished in the interest of public health and safety. While the ministry was contemplating the demolition, it received an unsolicited proposal by letter dated the 16th of December 2016, expressing an interest in the property to be used as a bed and breakfast facility. And this proposal was going to incorporate parking and shower facilities that would be accessible to members of the public, making use of the adjacent beach and beach access. The ministry saw this request as an opportunity to have public parking facilities provided at the site 15 years after acquisition, and it also appeared to be a means of extracting the economic value from the property rather than letting the value be lost to demolition. As a result, the ministry was able to successfully request a stay of execution of the aforementioned notice. Responses were again sought from the General Manager of the NCC, who advised inter alia by letter dated 9 February 2018 that the Commission's lack of financial resources had restricted it from acting in terms of this building. On May the 19th, the Cabinet reviewed the matter and agreed to a lease for a term of 25 years with an option to renew for a further 25 years. The leasee Mahogany Park Inc. will be responsible for, among other things, putting and keeping the premises in good repair, inclusive of structural repair throughout the term, bearing the cost of developing the site and complying with town planning of the site statutory requirements, all outgoings inclusive of land taxes, property and liability insurances arising from the use of the premises, insuring the premises at its full reinstatement cost in the joint names of the Crown and the company, and maintenance of the premises, which shall be kept clean and tidy and appropriately landscaped. Bearing in mind that the proposed leasee is expected to spend more than $500,000 to rehabilitate the currently dilapidated building, it is proposed that the initial rent be $9,920 per year for the first 5 years. From years 6 to 10, the rent will be doubled. These are concessionary rents, of course, but from year 11 to the end of the 25-year term, the rents will be market rate rents. The building reverts to the Crown free of charge after this period ends. And the ministry feels that the project embodies what the government has been advocating, indeed all governments, when it speaks of entering joint venture arrangements to bring its disused buildings not just back into a state of good repair, but also become revenue-generating, revenue-earning mechanisms. Mr. President, with this overview, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. President. I intend today to be extremely brief. I know I will be. I know that I have meetings as well, so I'm not going to be long at all. And I know that the leader of government business also has a meeting. This resolution is one which I support, and I support fully. Of course, when we speak about bed and breakfast, and we speak about any tourism-related entity, we have to reflect on the fact that this is a time when tourism really is literally at a standstill. And I want to give the assurance, though, that even though that is the case, we are working very closely, the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, working with the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association, the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc., and Intimate Hotels of Barbados, with respect to those very critical matters as it relates to the reopening of Barbados. Many persons are asking the question, when will Barbados reopen? Of course, the airport is presently closed to commercial activity until the 30th of June. I can tell you, sir, that a lot of airlines have indicated that they would wish to come back in July. American Airlines, JetBlue, there's airlines out of the UK, British Airways and Virgin. Of course, there are discussions still being undertaken by the Barbados Tourism Marketing Inc. as well with those airlines, because we are in a situation where we can reasonably expect that when the airlift comes back, the airlift will not be to the extent of what we would have had in the past. And in addition to that, while you will get an aircraft coming back, that aircraft may come back with only 60% of the capacity on the aircraft. It is important for us that as we reopen, we ensure that we put the necessary protocols in place to minimize any transmissions and to ensure that there isn't a significant second spike or a significant second wave. I believe that the Minister of Health and Wellness would have today had a press briefing where he would have indicated that a number of persons coming off of the JetBlue flight would have tested positive, 4 persons coming off of that flight. And that signals that it is important for us to have the protocols in place, because what we do not want to do is to open en masse, and then the next thing that you have would be a situation where there are significant infections and where we have to go through the procedures that we went through before with respect to the lockdown to ensure that the curve is flattened. In that regard, there are discussions that are being undertaken with respect to finalizing the protocols for accommodation. I am expecting, Mr. President, that in this environment we will continue to see things related to the constant washing of hands, related to wearing masks, related to testing, and relating to those matters that would ensure that we keep Barbados safe. Barbados safe, safe for Barbadians, safe for visitors, safe for residents of Barbados. That is critical and that is important. So, sir, in supporting this resolution, I simply wanted to communicate that efforts are being made to ensure that the reopening of Barbados is safe. We at the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association do agree fully with the Prime Minister when she informs that you should not simply be focusing on a date, but you should be focusing on ensuring that you have the appropriate protocols in place in order to make sure that we have no more significant infections and to make sure that we can properly manage and function in the new COVID-19 environment. Mr. President, with those few words, I want to offer my support to this resolution. Thank you.
Mr. President, I want to thank Senator Grant, and I beg to move that this resolution do not pass.
Question is that the resolution relating to item number 1 on the order paper do now pass. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. You think the ayes have it?
Mr. President,
Resolution has been passed.
Mr. President, I'm sorry. If I may just interrupt you very briefly before we get to wherever we are in the process. I just have a quick question in relation to this bill. If I may, I don't know procedurally if I'm correct, but I do have a question.
There you go.
So can I just go?
I think that the crime may very well be too late.
Is it too late?
I think the resolution has been.
Oh, it has a okay. Thank you.
Mr. President, I believe that has brought us to the end of today's business. I beg to move that the Honourable Senate be now adjourned until next Wednesday, the 17th of June. Thank you. At 11 a.m.
Question is that the Senate be now adjourned until next Wednesday, the 17th. Yes, next week, the 17th of June, 2020. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it, and we now stand adjourned until the 17th of June,